Hello, good morning. This is Luis Gonzalez. Welcome again to Readmagine and the Digital Publishing Summit. Today we have Alexandra Borg and Eric Wikberg, who are going to be presented and interact with Carlo Carreño, the Director of Publish News. I just want to remind you that you have this question tab in the next to the chat, and you can address to the two professors of the Stockholm School of Business anything, and I will read aloud your questions after their presentation. And please, Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. Well, it's a pleasure to be moderating this panel. I don't know how everyone knows that, even though I'm the Director of Publish News in Spain, I'm a Brazilian who lives in Sweden. And one of the best things I found here in Sweden for publishing is the statistics, all the data we have available here. It's really a paradise, especially if you speak Swedish. So it's a pleasure to be moderating this panel with Alexander Borg and Eric Wikberg. So I'll just make a short introduction of them. So Alexandra is the Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature and a lecturer in Swedish. And she completed her PhD in 2011 with a dissertation on the fin de secular literature of Stockholm. And she also was a researcher at the Bonnier Publishing Group. Her concerns today are more in modern publishing business and the future of the book. And I really like her motto because I think it's very Swedish. Her motto in life is, if you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. And that's by Donald Draper from Mad Men. And I think that's very Swedish. And then Eric is basically the guy who controls and knows everything about book numbers in Sweden and makes all the reports for the booksellers and the Publishers Association. But he's a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm School of Economics, and he focuses in art and literature. He's also an assistant professor in war studies at the Swedish Defense University. So that makes me wonder if you need to know about war to survive in the book business. And just make it short, his life motto is very Brazilian, because it's gotta go bang and it has to be fun. Otherwise, I won't come. And that's Astrid Lindbergh's character Carson says in the book, The World's Best Carson. But that's absolutely Brazilian. If it's not fun, you'll never show up. So the floor is yours. Have a good presentation, and you'll be having the questions and asking them in the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Carlos. Hi, everyone.
Yes, yeah. So the topic of our talk today is the Corona crisis in the age of digital reproduction, and we're of course sad that we can meet you in person in Spain, but this of course are very challenging times, and both the medium doing this via Zoom and the topic itself is our sort of result.
So, yeah, it's a very different setting for us, but we make our best.
Yes.
So, as Carlos said, I'm a PhD. I have a background in comparative literature, and I'm nowadays a lecturer in Swedish at Uppsala University. And I'm also part of the research group, Welfare State Analytics. It's founded by the Swedish Research Council.
Yes, and as everything has been said about me, I'm an organizational theorist doing studies on cultural fields. I did my PhD on the art world, and then I focus now the recent years on literature, and that's also my personal great interest.
And you're non-fiction expert in Swedish Arts Council.
Yes, so I do. I review literature, non-fiction literature, to see, to assess the quality of them, and it's a very fun thing. You have to read a lot of books.
So the Swedish book industry in the long perspective. In a way, the book industry in Sweden is very traditional. The physical bookstore today works roughly as they did a century ago, or even 150 years ago. However, the book industry was one of the first industries exposed to digital competition. The first wave of digitalization in Sweden was around 2005, 2003. It was followed by a second wave of digitalization in the form of digital subscription services.
Exactly, and I mean, it's not a coincidence that Amazon started selling books, because this is a product that, physical books, this is a product that is very good to sell online.
You don't have any returns, and it's an easy product to sell. So here is Eric's charts, and as you can see, it's a brief view of the early sales for the last years.
Yes, and just to this is just to give you a background. The numbers itself are not that important in isolation. But if we start with physical bookstores, we see that they have had a decline of about 4 or 5% each year since 2016. And just as a sort of business studies ABC, this is not these numbers are nominal. So given inflation, the sales of books has actually decreased more.
Yeah.
And also I think that it's important to note that just staying at a zero rate growth is not really sustainable, because all your suppliers will have a growth and all your competitors, in other industries. So if you want to compete, you have to at least grow at the same rate as the economy as a whole. So these numbers are important to improve. And if you look at the online retailers and book clubs, the reason why they are put together like this is because there are so few online retailers in Sweden, so we have to combine them so that they can't see each other's sales figures. They have generally had, it's been pretty stable. They had a decline in 2019, but other than that, they have grown. Grocery stores, just as physical bookstores, have had big declines, even more so in percentage than the physical bookstores. And then lastly, the digital subscription services. That is Storytel, that is the biggest actor, BookBeat, Nextory, and Bokus Play. There are four different actors in this field in Sweden. They've had an immense growth these last years, especially in 2016 and 2017. And so they are really the reason why we've had small increases on the whole, because if you wouldn't have had them, then the market would really actually go down.
Yeah. And here we see a snapshot of 2019. And as you can see, the online retailers are the biggest sales channel and the grocery stores are the smallest one. And it's also a question of time before digital subscription services will pass physical bookstores as the second biggest sales channels in Sweden.
Exactly, and this is in 1,000 Swedish crowns, so it's you can divide it by 10 approximately to get euros. And it's interesting, just one note with this data set is that it's a sort of census study that it's not a sample, randomized sample. We do try to collect all the bookstores, all the book sales in Sweden every day on a daily basis. And so and this covers about 80% of all the book sales in Sweden. However, if you look at those that we don't have, they are typically physical bookstores, grocery stores, small actors. So if you compare these, it's physical bookstores are actually a bit higher, but there is a sort of it's very probable that the digital subscription services will very soon be bigger than the physical bookstores in Sweden.
So how has the corona pandemic what had the corona pandemic done to the book business? And Eric will say that it has reinforced the long-term development, and it does so very dramatically.
Yes, so this previous table that we showed you with the long-term trends, then if you would just sort of extrapolate on those numbers, it is like that we have fast forward a couple of years in this recent development. And so, for instance, the physical bookstores, they are the ones that have suffered the most from this crisis, and they have declined 35.4%. And this is very, one note is that this only includes books. And of course, physical bookstores sell other things than books. And it might be on the total a bit better because people buy a lot of office supplies in these times. But still, it is a huge decline, also considering that the profit margins in this business is not really typically high compared to other industries. If you look at online retailers, they have actually increased their sales during this crisis. And that is, of course, one reason is that people buy online instead of buying from physical bookstores, and also that a lot of people work from home and maybe think a lot about life in general.
And also we can say that in Sweden, we haven't had a lockdown. So the stores have been open during the corona pandemic, but we have had strong restrictions for the elderly people. So if you're older than 65, you are strongly recommended to keep indoors.
Yes, exactly. And then as a final note, it's really interesting that there are huge regional differences in Sweden. So some bookstores are not really affected, even though that this category as a whole is of course a lot of affected. And also if you're, for example, located at an airport, your sales are probably going down a lot more than 35%. So there are individual differences between actors, and that's something that is really important to note. It's like if you have one hand in an ice bucket and one on a hot coal, then you don't feel on average pretty good. And then the grocery stores have also declined, and in total we've seen a decline of about 4.6%. This does not include digital subscription services, however, because they report only every quarter.
And on this slides, we see two renowned figures in Sweden, in the Swedish book business. From top to down, we see Dan Pannas, he's the communication director at Storytel. And underneath him, it's Jonas Tellander, the founder and CEO of Storytel. And what we can say is that the digital subscription services seems to perform very, very well during the pandemic. And as Dan Pannas says, is that Storytel as a company has noticed an increased interest in stories, in fiction, in people want to be entertained and they want to relax. So it's an escapistic drive to fiction. And as Jonas Tellander says, it's from an interview you did with him, isn't it?
No, it's not, but it's public data.
That Storytel experienced a continuous strong influx of customers during the quarter and more than doubled in the last 2 weeks of March, which is unparalleled in Storytel's history.
So even though that we don't have sales figures for these actors yet, I think that we will have them very soon, actually. They have communicated that this is that they are doing well in Corona times.
And even though we haven't had a lockdown in Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. So just to remind you, the first wave of digitalization, as we call it, is when the online retailers entered the scene and took a lot of business from the physical bookstores. And the second one is when the digital subscription services came along and changed the whole scene again.
Yes. So what distinguishes and characterizes the second wave of digitalization from the first? The digital subscription services have a completely different business model than the online bookstore. They sell only digital formats, especially audiobooks. And Storytel, compared to Amazon Audible, for example, they have this all-you-can-eat model. They sell a prescription, but they don't sell piece-by-piece sales in that prescription. And it also, this changes the typical process of how different priced formats are launched and marketed. The audiobook companies, they sell also other genres and much more backlist. And it has also totally different corporate valuations and financial terms than traditional bookstores. And maybe Eric, you can expand some on
yes,
that.
exactly. We will come back to that on the discussion point later, but the whole point is that the digital subscription services, they are not very profitable. They are focusing strategically on increasing the revenue, but they are not increasing profit. So most of them lost money. It's like they invest a lot, and to expect that this will be profitable in the future. And that is something. One of the main actors in this market actually had bigger losses than they had the revenue. So it's and if that would be a typical physical bookstore, they wouldn't be let to do that. So these corporate valuation and the financial terms behind them are very important. And also, just to expand a little bit on how this changes how the how different how formats are typically launched. Typically, you have first the hardcover book and try to sort of make your business and make profits on that, and then the pocketbooks and the big pocketbooks, certain audio books have been sort of extras, whereas now the audiobooks are launched pretty much the same time as the hardcover book, and that changes the whole dynamic of the business.
So it's simultaneously launched.
Yeah.
So just to give you a short history of the audiobook in Sweden, it differs a bit from what the history in the States and also in England. The audiobook in Sweden, it has grown both stepwise and rapidly. It was a format that was meant or directed to the visually impaired in the 1980s. And then from late 19th and onwards, it has been physical audiobooks on CD-ROMs and later MP3 files. 2005, we have the first digital subscription services. And as Eric said, the revenue model has been discussed immensely, both at the boards of those companies, but also on the cultural page in Sweden. So it has been a discussion, and also Författarförbundet, the authors association has been discussed. So it's been discussed.
And there are some differences because like Storytel have this revenue share model, which means that you first look at you have a certain ratio of the income that they have that are given out to the authors and the publishers, whereas other subscription services have had that you get a fixed payment for each time a person listens to the audiobook. And this, of course, it is interesting when you have large increases in volume that are higher than large increases in sales, because that implies that the fixed income that you get the income that you get per listening decreases, and this has been the general development during the last years.
Yeah, and it also affects the writers who actually get paid. You say something about the VAT.
Yeah, value-added tax. That it is something that have been discussed for a couple of years, because before 1st of June 2019, if you downloaded audiobook, then you would have to pay 25% value-added tax. But if you would buy it on a physical, like a CD-ROM or MP3, then it was 6%, which doesn't really make any sense because it's an identical product.
The content is the same. So, yeah.
And that was harmonized.
So if we would step backwards, like 500 years, the evolution of the book. So the evolution of the book is a continuous history. It's a history of continuous accessibility. The technical developments of the book are often taken for granted. We don't see the book as what it actually is, namely a machine, a product that has been developed and redefined for a century. So if we see it as a technology, that technology has become a part of the everyday fabric. It has been woven into our everyday life. And typography, printing methods, paper quality, and text composing have improved gradually under 500 years. Many Swedes thought that the ebook, not the audiobook, would be the future book format, the rapture, but now it's the audiobook has taken that place. And what we can say is that the commercial failure of the ebook is due, I would say that, and Erik too, to the developers' inability to incorporate 500 years of technical development into their product. And also many ebook developers, they didn't have any insight or knowledge on actual reading behaviors, what readers actually needed and demanded. So just like Johannes Gutenberg's Bible was an imitation, a mimic of the handwritten Bible, the model or the idea for the ebook was the printed book.
Then something drastically happened.
Yeah. So the audiobook, then, yeah, the idea of the audiobook is an old one, or recently, quite old one. Octave Sand, a French science fiction writer, he wrote about ebooks and audiobooks in a late 19th century essay. And his point of departure is a very humoristic and critical and ironic one. Nevertheless, he argues that the audiobook actually fulfills a democratic and educational purpose. The narrator in this essay, he dreams of a society where literature and information are free and easily accessed, like Steve Jobs' fantasy. And one of the future scenarios that is presented is the possibility to read or reading while taking walks, being on a bus, or being outdoors. And what I want to say is that Storytel's contribution is exactly this. They have successfully launched a product, a device for reading that matches digital demands and is easily accessed, and at the same time has a kind of successful business model as utgångspunkt.
Yeah, as a point of departure.
As a point of departure. So during the 20th century, book design developed. Now we're talking about the physical book. Book design developed in two directions. One artistic one with William Morris and the printing press as a frontman, and one rational one with a focus on mass production, industrialization, and quick workflows. Both of these directions has influenced the design of today's books.
Please. No, sorry.
No. Now we have some questions for you and some questions to start a conversation.
Yes.
So, what would an even greater digitalization lead to, and how will publishing and book production change?
Exactly, and that's why we have this man who is well known in Sweden, but probably not elsewhere. His name is Jonas Gardell, and he's a very best-selling author, playwright, showman, stand-up comedian, a lot of things. And he wrote an essay where he argued that it is a big difference between writing for an audiobook or writing for a printed book. So for instance, he said that if he would print out his speeches to his shows and look at how it looks on paper, then it
and
would
modify it or adjust it for reading out loud. And the bottom line of his article was that it's something happening to the literature when it will be audible or
verbally.
Yeah, verbally. And he says between the line you can read that it's a much more not so complex literature that actually have been beneficial for the audio business.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some heuristics that, for instance, you don't want too many characters in audiobooks. Dostoevsky is really hard on audiobooks.
You got a much more simple narration and shorter syntax and so on. So a much more genre literature, really.
Yeah, and with cliffhangers, etc.
So, and what would an even greater digitalization lead to? Which players will survive and what will their offerings look like? What these immense opportunities to choose, and what will it do to literature, and what will it do to the book business and all the players in the book business?
Yeah. And here it's interesting to compare to, for instance, the services for film and TV, like Netflix, HBO, and a lot of different actors like that. In the book world, most of the books are accessible in every services. So it's really hard to justify to have several ones because you get pretty much the same package deal in all of them. And so will be very interesting to see if this will be the way that everyone will have everything, or if there will be more niched audiobook services for different kinds of customers. And to go back to the financial situation again, this situation with Storytel Storytel, which is a listed company, they've of course have had a really good success in the financial market. Without they are profitable in some markets, but they are mostly focusing on expanding, and so that resembles, for instance, first of all, Amazon, which is also now it's profitable, but they didn't do any profits for a long time, and also Spotify, which is has a valuation that is a lot higher, of course, than Storytel, and still haven't made any profits at all. So it is interesting to note if this is a new financial logic, and it's something that we need to follow.
So some conclusions and a summary. The book industry in Sweden and elsewhere is undergoing a tremendous change during the pandemic. And the companies that is the most resilient to these changes are the publishing houses and the retailers that already digitized a lot before Corona. And this development will have far-reaching consequences from both a business and a democratic point of view.
Exactly, and like now we're focusing on publishers and booksellers, but if you look at the authors in Sweden, they are of course both affected by the decreased sales, but then also all the events that they planned to do. Yes. The author talks, that's often one main source of income for these people. And so from this short introductory presentation, we draw two conclusions. The first, that the pandemic has dramatically accelerated the digitalization and the long-term trends of the Swedish book industry. And the second one, that
the history of book has always been a story of increased accessibility. Even in the times of this disruptive crisis, history repeats itself.
And that's exactly 30 minutes. We're looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have some questions for you from the audience. The first one, isn't Storytel an exception? For example, the only successful subscription service in the world, maybe with a script. Are there studies about why?
Why they are successful? It's interesting because one thing that we didn't mention, Storytel was founded in 2005. It was actually 1 year before Spotify. And it wasn't this very easy road that they just started and became successful. It was, they were almost bankrupt several times before they had this huge success. And if you look at the devices, the mobile phones that that people had back in those days, it's of course a whole other situation. So I think that the success was a lot dependent on the amount of people that had smartphones, and also that we are more and more accustomed to buying services like this in other, like having a subscription of Netflix and other sort of things. Back in those days, people were afraid to buy things on the internet because they thought they would be scammed somehow.
Yeah. And nowadays in Sweden, 99% have access to smartphones. So it's been very implemented.
But the question was if they are an exception. I would say that also, this is the only company that is listed, or Bokus Play belongs to a group that is listed. But I mean, it's harder to measure success when it comes to private companies. But I would still mark them as highly successful. If you look at Nextory, one of these four, they've had people want to invest in them, but it's hard to tell the market value of such companies since it's not on a public market.
And also it's very hard to compete with a very strong player that already has the market in a stronghold.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, speaking up on your own question, how much do you think this is just a Swedish phenomena, and how much Sweden could be just a lab and something that's actually in the future and that it's gonna be the whole world? So how much of this phenomena is only in Sweden, or how much do you think it can go global?
I think it would go global. Swedes are generally very open-minded towards digital. They're not digital natives, many, but we are very open-minded towards digital changes. So
yeah, and there are. I mean, I would also say that I think there are good preconditions to make it globally, but then it is. It's really hard to pinpoint, but you have these different national characteristics, like why are ebooks popular in some countries and in some countries not? It's not really easy to always, and like Amazon, the market share that they have in different countries also differs a lot. So it's really hard to actually like compare global against Sweden, because it's like the global setting consists, of course, of a lot of diverse countries with different cultures.
And also in Sweden also, which is interesting, the book as an artifact has been very influential. We have this German heritage from Gutenberg. So we're book friendly, we're very bookish people. So
it's also been very symbolic, like if you look at some politicians when they talk about their, what is
important to them, to say reading and books. So the book has been an object, a symbol of Bildung, education, and so on.
And if you didn't have books in your upbringing, that's a sign of, it's something that people often mention. Not
okay. Here is a big one, a big question. What do you think the increase of subscriptions will do to the publishing sector? Is it sustainable in the midterm?
I think that there are certain developments we'll see how it develops, if there will be, like these genre literatures, crime, feel-good, romance, etc. That is the genres that are most popular today in subscription sites, and like nonfiction is not really that big in subscription services, etc. So if this development continues, then I think that it's actually grocery shops that are going to be affected most. But this question was about other publishers, right?
This question, I think this is a core question, because it is asking if for our publishing industry, this kind of subscription model is sustainable from the point of view of the economics of each of the publishing houses or the publishing groups, you know, the revenue system and all.
Yeah.
I mean, if I just can drop in, you mentioned that that the platforms are not profitable, that the revenues per titles are going down. And so is it really, that's the question, why is it sustainable? Because we see some signs now, just playing the devil's advocate here, but you see some signs now that shows that's going to be very tough in the future.
But also audiobook production is quite expensive. It's only the big publishers that actually can afford it. So the small publishers in Sweden, which are the ones who produce or sell quality literature, not genre literature, they can't often afford to make audiobooks of their launched books.
Yeah.
So that's also will be a huge disruption, I think.
I think one point that I try to make with if some sales channels, like if subscription services will mostly sell genre literature in the future, then the physical bookstores will probably be more niched against quality literature, non-fiction literature, and
science fiction, cookbooks. Yeah,
exactly. And then if you look at the grocery stores that just sells the bestsellers, very few titles and a lot of sales, they will probably be the most affected by subscription services, because that's the same genres.
Yeah, Eric, but okay, sorry.
One good thing is that you actually have the backlist. The backlist will be more accessible on a subscription model. So the backlist will be more easily accessed. Yes. So that's one good thing about it.
And also I think that one sort of good point to make is also that one person that subscribes for this service for 1 year, and it's not if it's not the person that have bought a lot of books before, they go from being customers that are sort of very non-profitable customers to, since it's quite a lot of money they spend on a year in these services per person, so they go to being a sort of recurrent good customer directly. So like if you look at the total sales, it's not really, and that is of course what publishing houses are looking at. Those numbers are not so bad. It's just that it's challenging for physical bookstores, and then you have sales that compensate for that in the subscription services models. Yeah. And then it of course depends on what sort of publishing house you are. If you're more attuned to the digital formats, then you're likely going to have a good future. If you mostly sell translated quality literature that only sells in bookstores, then you're going to have harder times.
But also the decline in the physical bookstores and the sales. I mean, the physical bookstore, it's a window for the book. And when that window more and more closes, the idea of the physical book will also drop, or it won't be that visible anymore in the society, in the public sphere.
Okay, next one. Aren't publishers considering pulling out of the revenue share models because of the fact that their revenue is not great?
Yeah, it's a.
You should ask a publisher.
It is. There was a debate in Sweden about this revenue model, and there was a lot of secrecy about it, and it involved Bonnier, which is the largest publisher in Sweden, and Storytel, and so I mean and of course the reason why there is a critique against this revenue model is that some publishers think that the income per listening is not as good as it should be.
Okay, let's ask Carlo. Do you have a point on this?
Yep. I have a question that's a little bit more in a different direction. Every time I talk to Eric and I listen to his presentations, you always mention democracy and the importance of books for that. Could you elaborate a little bit on the importance of making the books more accessible and in the subscription platforms to the democracy and to give everyone a voice? I think that's an important thing.
Yeah.
It's not really business, but maybe more important.
There are American studies that show that 17-year-olds that have read a lot when they grow up and have had parents that read to them, they have a vocabulary of 50,000 to 70,000 words compared to 17-year-olds that didn't have this, that didn't read and that didn't have parents that read to them, and they have a vocabulary of 15,000 to 17,000 words. And if you think about this, this is really, in order to actually understand media, to understand important discussions on societal views, it's actually a necessity for democracy that people can read and read good, not only understand complex reasosoning, because otherwise we will have one part of society that will miss out on so many of their opportunities and so much of the influence that they should have on our country and other countries.
And I would like to add that this presentation, it concerned the publishing business. So we haven't mentioned that actually libraries in Sweden, public libraries, has also open access to audiobooks. So the audiobooks in Sweden has actually changed how we read. So it's not only the publishers or Storytel's.
And also there are huge differences between genders. Boys read a lot less than girls.
Listen,
and so it's something that we should always have our eyes on.
Okay, I think that I have to be faster, and you too, because we have lots of questions now.
Okay.
Questions. In your opinion, how can we help readers get out of the book, ebook, audiobook dichotomy? How can we help to understand and propose their complementarity?
I don't really think I got that question. How we can bring them back to physical books, or?
No. The question was on related on the dichotomy.
Okay.
Between ebook and print book and audiobook and ebook. So trying to break this dichotomy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What comes to mind are children's books that the child can both read and listen to and do it sort of.
And I think also if you talk to digital native ones, they don't see that dichotomy at all. They don't see it as different formats. It's like the same, the content, it's different platforms only.
Okay. Another one, this one is on the pandemic, on the corona. The pandemic has accelerated the digital development, but how do you think small bookstores that do not have large budgets will be able to adapt to implement a complementary online sales platform?
I think it's, it's a lot easier now than just a few years back. You must have this there are things like inventories and things like that, but just setting up a personal web shop is a lot easier now than before. But then I don't think that a lot of people think that that is their core business and their core skills, etc. So I don't think that the very small actors will all start doing internet sales, but technically it's been a lot easier now.
Alexandra, anything to add?
I agree.
Okay, next one. Do you think that in the near future will be mergers, partnerships among the entertainment streaming platforms, including the ebook and audiobook sector?
Yeah, I understand the question. I wouldn't. There might. Yeah.
So the real question is Spotify gonna walk 5 blocks and talk to Storytel, right? But we don't know
yet. Another one. This is Enrico Turins. By the way, we have Anne Bergman and Enrico from the European Federation of Publishers here with us. We at the Federation of European Publishers lobbied hard to get the possibility to apply reduced VAT to digital books in the EU member states. The Swedish Publishers Association helped a lot on that. So we are happy you mentioned it. Did you notice an impact on the reduction of VAT on digital books in Sweden?
Yes, in audiobooks. I mean, it is.
Well, he said digital books, but could be also audiobooks.
The positive thing with revenue share model in this case is that they didn't change their prices, and that means that they of course got in more money. So it's and then you have this long-term trend. So it's very hard to exclude like what is the effect of the VAT, because I mean most actors didn't change their prices. They said that they anticipated this and the prices were set before with that in mind. But of course, VAT is a very, very important question for the book sales, and I would be happy to see lower taxes on books in all of Europe.
Do all the Swedish publishers include their front list titles from launch on subscription platforms?
Yes, they when they are when they are launched as hardcover books, they are often also
simultaneously launched as audiobooks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Storytel is now in many countries, with the Netherlands as one of the first outside Sweden. It's interesting to see that subscription prices in the Netherlands are €4 to €5 lower compared to Sweden for all subscription variants. Do your research has shown any base for the Swedish subscription prices? Did you notice an increase in pricing during the years?
No, they've been very stable, actually. But then I would guess that, if I would actually think that it would be good if the prices for these services could go up, because even though they are lower in the Netherlands, they are still not profitable. So it's and that's important to have a sustainable audiobook market, that either that you get more customers or that they can raise the price, because it's not really long-term sustainable as it is now.
So a subscription on Storytel costs around €17 a month, and a hard book cover costs around 250-300 crowns in Sweden. So it's nearly the half price.
Yeah.
And then you get free access to all the content.
What was the biggest challenge for you to show the advantages to the subscriptions model for publishers?
Can you repeat that question? I didn't get it.
Yeah, what was the biggest challenge for you to show the advantages of this model to the publishers?
Well, I think that if I would argue, I mean, I don't negotiate, or I'm really not in this situation, but if I would look on the positive sides, I would say that if it doesn't have a negative impact on the sales of physical books, then it's all extras and it's good, and it makes you can reach other target groups, and you can also, this point that Alexandra made with the backlist is very important, that if you're an author and you get revenue from your old books, then it's you're less dependent on writing a new bestseller every year to make a living. So that's on the positive side. And then I would also say that it is sort of, if you would compare the price that you get from a listening on one of these services, it's like when you rent a film on Netflix, that you expect that to be lower cost than actually buying the film on a DVD. So it's like apples and oranges, that you should really think of this differently. But the whole thing is, if it will lead to that people only listen to the audiobook, whether by hardcover books or pocketbooks, then it's very challenging. But on the positive side, if it's just adding on, then it's actually positive.
But how do you see things in Sweden so far? Do you think there is a good trade-off, or do you see a cannibalization so far? Maybe you can comment on the numbers last year that were quite interesting.
I mean, it is. I think that I think that it's a bit inconclusive to say if this has a negative impact. I think that some people automatically think that when book sales in physical bookstores go down, you think that this must be caused by digital subscription services, because if their sales goes up. But this link is not really. It's not something that is self-evident, but then I do think that there are, of course, there are these effects that people, when they've listened to a book, they don't buy it. But I don't think that it's a very, very strong effect. And I also think there are positive effects. So it's a mix of everything.
Do you think that we are near to a saturation point in terms of budget for subscriptions with all the wide offer?
I think that the acceleration or the expansion, at least in Sweden, you see that it goes down, but it's still expanding a lot. I mean, at some point, we won't have any more people in Sweden that will become new customers.
No.
But it is still a very growing market. But then all growing markets will at some point be saturated. So that's, of course, it will be. And then hopefully it will also be profitable.
And there is another one. Have BookBeat not responded to the non-profitability of the all-you-can-eat model by introducing a tiered subscription model? How successful are they with this? Do you know?
I don't have their last numbers. I mean, when I said that they, at some point, it was back in a few years when they had larger losses than their incomes. But then I do think that they are becoming more and more less profitable. I mean, they are improving, and I think that their numbers from last year is probably a lot better than when they were in their early expansion phases.
So when Alexandra spoke about the niche, I think this is a very important issue, because when we do our research on reading behavior in Spain, we have two different categories of readers: frequent, strong readers who are niche, and the other kind of people that I suppose in the Alexandra predictions would be coming back to the little bookstores and buy a lot of books, as we usually do. But in our system in Spain and in other countries, we have this kind of funding for these kind of books I mean, within a big publishing group, there are big books that are sold in the groceries, in the big stores. These revenues help the publishing houses to publish these other kind of books. So how do you see this is going to behave in the future? And Carlo, maybe you can add anything about these issues within this new business model. So I think that is too hard for the publishing industry facing too many things at the same time, you know, because we are losing these retailing points because of the pandemic. I'm sure of that in Spain and in Italy. At the same time, we have these new business models. I think that is interesting to hear from you about your opinions on that.
I mean, I think it's interesting because in Sweden you talked about Gånger och karusell. Does that translate to English? That you have this some bestsellers.
The swings and the carousel, yeah.
Yeah, that actually finance the poetry and all the avant-garde things. When you look at how the digitalization works, it's not, I mean, there are some companies that are some publishers that are very in good times now because they have digital products that they're very specialized on these things. And then they are probably not likely to start publishing poetry, etc. So it is, there is a challenge there that it might impact the sort of quality literature negatively, I would say.
And also what actually have been migrated to audiobooks is mainly genre fiction, not so much non-fiction, and of course not cookbooks and so. So what we can see, it's a decline actually in sales figures of non-fiction books and also cookbooks and lifestyle books.
Yeah.
If I can comment, I was just going to say that if you could look at the genres, especially in Sweden, basically non-fiction doesn't happen in audio, just stretching that a little bit. If you go to the other countries, in Spanish, in Latin America, when you talk to Storytel, you do have some non-fiction on board, but it's more like self-development and stuff like that. So if I can call serious non-fiction a trade, this area is not being tackled by the audiobooks. So if audiobooks become extremely important and there is no genre change, traditional good non-fiction might lose a lot of ground, I think.
Yeah. And I can imagine, I've in several interviews mentioned that poetry should be very good for audiobooks, which, and then I always added that I don't think this is really probable that it's going to happen, but you know, you can see that there are some potential there, you know, that listening to poetry is better than just reading it. But then it is sort of also performative. If we talk too much about digital subscription services that they only sell or that people only want crime literature and feel-good romance, then it's not likely that people will try to market these more qualified quality literature and poetry and other art forms that we think are important to
become like a self-fulfillment.
It's a self-fulfilling thing there.
Yeah. But also we read this report yesterday on how quality literature, like Nobel Prize winners, and we have this August Prize in Sweden, how the tillgången,
how accessible they were
in Storytel, and they were very low, so they're not visible enough. So and also it says itself, if you don't have access to it, then you won't actually discover it and read it.
It might, of course, also be that publishers think that we presume that these titles will not be listened to, and therefore they won't do any audiobooks. But it is important to note that, I mean, they have such many books, and then if you come to Nobel laureates, there are so many missing. So that's sort of an interesting observation.
So interesting. I would like to spend more time talking about these things, but we have to finish this session. I would like to remind all the participants that this afternoon we have Cristina Mosinelli again with accessibility certification. And I just really thank you, ever so thank you, Eric, Alexandra, and Carlo for your help with this issue. Thank you very much, and bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you.